Hello, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into a topic that is absolutely critical in clinical practice: how we prescribe medications for older adults. You know, as our patients age, their bodies just don't handle drugs the same way. This ramps up the risk of harm, so getting this right, well, it's fundamental to safe and effective care. We're going to break down exactly how to approach it.
So let's start with this. This single sentence is really the heart of the matter. It captures the entire challenge perfectly. See, the very process of getting older systematically changes how a body absorbs, uses, and gets rid of a medication. This isn't some rare exception. It's a physiological rule that should be at the front of our minds with every single prescription.
All right, here's our game plan. We're going to tackle this systematically. First, we'll talk about the why, the absolute clinical need to handle this differently. Then, we'll look at the actual risks involved, lay out the core principles for managing them, and then, this is the fun part, we'll apply them to some real-world case vignettes. We'll wrap up with strategies to stay one step ahead of the risks.
Okay, so first up, establishing the geriatric imperative. Those physiological changes we just talked about, they aren't just textbook theory. They lead to some seriously altered drug responses that force us to rethink our entire approach and move way beyond those one-size-fits-all protocols. This, of course, brings us to the heightened risk that our older patients face. And you know, there's no clearer example of this vulnerability than what we see with infectious diseases. They serve as a powerful and frankly sobering example of how age can just dramatically worsen clinical outcomes.
Just look at this number. For Lassa fever, the risk of mortality goes up 1.5 times for every single decade of a patient's life. Think about that. It's a potent, progressive vulnerability that we as clinicians absolutely have to anticipate and manage.
And this isn't some isolated thing. The pattern is just remarkably consistent across a whole range of different pathogens. It doesn't matter if we're looking at viruses like influenza and COVID-19 or bacteria like C. difficile, the takeaway is exactly the same. Once a patient is over 60, the risk for severe disease and death climbs significantly.
Okay, so recognizing this heightened risk is step one. But what's next? Well, the next step is to establish a clear set of principles for how we act. This is where we really move beyond just standard dosing and get into the fine art and science of geriatric pharmacotherapy.
And this right here is the core of the solution. Standard, by-the-book dosing, it's just not reliable enough. We have to pivot to a two-pronged strategy. First, individualized dosing that's guided by pharmacokinetics, and second, constant checking through what we call therapeutic drug monitoring, or TDM. This isn't just a nice-to-have. It's a clinical necessity for this population. Now, theory is one thing, but putting it into practice is everything. So let's translate these principles into what they actually look like in the clinic. We'll walk through a few case vignettes, focusing on some specific, high-risk medications.
Our first case is all about aminoglycosides. This class of antibiotics is a powerhouse, no doubt, but it's also notorious for having a really narrow therapeutic window, and that means there's a high risk of toxicity, especially in older adults.
The main problem with aminoglycosides is just how variable they are. You could give two patients the same standard weight-based dose and get wildly different drug concentrations in their blood. It creates this dangerous tightrope walk between a dose that's too low to work and one that causes severe kidney or hearing damage.
So the strategy for managing them flows right from that core principle we talked about. You must use individualized dosing models. You must start TDM to make sure you're in that sweet spot. And you must be actively looking for any signs of toxicity. When you do this, you turn what feels like an uncertain art into a much more manageable science. All right, on to our second case. This time we're looking at the antifungal voriconazole, which presents a completely different, but just as tricky pharmacokinetic challenge.
The key phrase here is nonlinear pharmacokinetics. So what on earth does that mean? Well, in simple terms, it means that doubling the dose doesn't mean you'll get double the drug level. You might get triple, or you might get almost no change at all. This incredible variability, not just between patients, but even in the same patient over time, makes dosing an absolute minefield. Because of that, the monitoring for voriconazole has to be really aggressive and protocol-driven. TDM isn't just a suggestion here. It's recommended for every single patient. You have to check levels early, you have to repeat them weekly, and you have to be on high alert for specific side effects, like neurotoxicity and liver damage, that are tied to very specific concentration levels.
Now, this whole principle of targeted monitoring isn't just for those 2 drugs. It extends to a lot of other critical medications. Our last vignette will touch on 2 more quick examples, isoniazid and ganciclovir, which both demand close surveillance for organ-specific side effects, especially in our older patients.
For isoniazid, the big worry is the liver. The risk of hepatotoxicity shoots up after age 50, which means monthly liver function tests are mandatory. For ganciclovir, on the other hand, the risk is to the bone marrow and the kidneys, so that requires weekly checks of blood counts and creatinine. The crucial point here is that for drugs like these, proactive surveillance is the only way you're going to catch and prevent severe complications.
So we've looked at individual drugs. For our final section, let's zoom out a bit to proactive risk mitigation. This means looking beyond just one prescription at a time and anticipating risks from common drug classes and really dangerous interactions.
Corticosteroids are a perfect example of dose-dependent risk. At a low daily dose of prednisolone, let's say under 10 milligrams, we're generally not too worried about significant immunosuppression. But the moment you cross that 10 milligram threshold, the risk of infection goes up, and you can even see a reduced response to vaccines. For us, that dose is a critical line in the sand.
And finally, here are just a few more key areas to be vigilant about. We always have to remember to adjust fluoroquinolones for kidney function. We need to recognize that some older drugs like Diane-35 are no longer considered safe for their original purpose. And we have to be constantly screening for those critical drug-drug interactions, like the ones that can affect caspofungin or erythromycin. This level of diligence just has to become our standard practice.
So we'll end with this question. The evidence is overwhelming. There is profound variability in how older adults handle medication. So the challenge ahead for all of us in clinical practice is, how do we evolve? How do we move beyond these generalized, one-size-fits-all guidelines and start building systems that deliver truly personalized, dynamic, and ultimately safer prescribing for every single older patient we see?